There are new signs now the workload of the federal probe may be growing. Bloomberg News reports today that, quote, Mueller is tapping additional Justice Department resources for help with new legal battles. According to current and former U.S. officials, he's making more use of career prosecutors from the offices of U.S. attorneys and from Justice Department headquarters, as well as FBI agents, a sign that he may be laying the groundwork to hand off parts of his investigation eventually. Much of that extra manpower has gone toward prosecuting or sentencing the 20 people who've already been indicted in the probe. Meanwhile, Mueller is still awaiting a decision on whether the president will testify before his prosecutors. Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani had previously said there would be an answer by July 4th. However, CBS News now reporting that as of Giuliani's deadline yesterday, he had no decision to announce, which could set the stage for a potential confrontation over a presidential subpoena. Joining me now, Barbara McQuade, a former U.S. attorney and an MSNBC contributor. Barbara, first on this issue of more resources and what that signals in terms of where this investigation is and where it may be going. How do you read that?
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but I can think of three possible reasons that he might be adding more lawyers. I mean, one is that he's got big charges coming and he needs additional bodies to work on that. A second theory, and maybe more likely, is just he already has a lot on his plate. We've got the July trial of Paul Manafort coming up. There have been lots of motions for discovery in the Internet research case. And so I could see just needing additional manpower to handle that. And the third reason is that there may be parts of this case that are more tangential and might, once he closes up shop as special counsel, can be farmed out to U.S. attorneys' offices so that they can maintain continuity on those. So those are three possibilities.
The issue of Trump, the issue of the president talking to prosecutors, Giuliani saying July 4th will have an answer. It is now July 5th. How much time can Giuliani and the Trump legal team string this out before they have to give some kind of a definitive answer?
Yeah, they seem to keep moving the goalposts every time a deadline comes, extending it further. At some point, Robert Mueller is really going to have to make a decision whether how much he wants this testimony. Does he serve a subpoena on the president, or does he let him move on without even talking to him? And I think he has been keen to negotiate some sort of voluntary sit-down so that he can avoid what, you know, many people may describe as a constitutional crisis. That phrase gets used a lot, but I think if you were to subpoena President Trump and if you were to refuse to comply with that subpoena, we might actually have that constitutional crisis where you would have this very strange scenario of a judge potentially ordering marshals to arrest a president who's protected by the Secret Service. So I think Robert Mueller will try to avoid that at all costs and try to negotiate it. Or he may at some point just say, you know, this is his chance, President Trump's chance, to tell his side of the story. And if he doesn't want to avail himself of that opportunity, maybe Robert Mueller just moves on and files his report with Congress or indictment or whatever he decides to do.
And meanwhile, yesterday, more hints that Michael Cohen may be close to cutting a deal, maybe even potentially flipping on the president. Cohen, who once described himself on Twitter as a personal attorney to President Donald Trump, has scrubbed his profile page, removing his affiliation with the president. Similarly, Cohen revised his profile on LinkedIn to show that his work for the president ended in June. This comes as NBC Tonight confirms a report from the New York Times that Cohen has hired attorney Lanny Davis, prominent Democratic operative, a close Clinton ally. In his statement, Davis said that Michael Cohen deserves to tell his side of the story, subject, of course, to the advice of counsel. Barbara, I'm just curious what you make of the maneuverings from Michael Cohen the past week, the online activity, the interview with ABC News, this thing about Lanny Davis right now. I think there's been some debate here about whether this is about the court of public opinion or the court of law that we're talking about. What do you make of what he's doing, and does it say anything about his legal situation to you?
It's interesting. It seems that Michael Cohen is working very hard to rehabilitate his public image as much as anything. I don't think that the Southern District of New York is going to, much care about or find value in what's on his Twitter account or what he says to George Stephanopoulos. But I do think that it seems that Michael Cohen is trying to, as he has said, I won't be the villain in this story. And Lanny Davis is not only a lawyer, but he also runs a PR firm. And so Michael Cohen already has a very fine lawyer in Guy Petrillo to handle the legal matters. Adding Lanny Davis to this case seems like an effort to win over the court of public opinion as much as anything. So I'm not sure what's going on there other than maybe repairing his reputation. Maybe he believes it adds to his value or his credibility as a cooperator in the case with the Southern District of New York. But at any rate, he does seem to be signaling a severance with Donald Trump, and that probably bodes well for anyone who is hoping that Michael Cohen will cooperate against him.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.